Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Today, I am thrilled to be sitting down with Gene Kansas, who, in addition to being an award-winning cultural developer, a preservationist, a social entrepreneur, he's also an author. And he's just published a new book that we're going to be digging into, Civil Sites. It comes from the University of Georgia Press. And it's all about Sweet Auburn. We're going to learn more about what all that means and really dig into something that I think has a lot of potential to impact the way people not only understand that neighborhood, but also understand neighborhoods around them and perhaps provide some context and some inspiration for this kind of documentation and storytelling. But before we get into that, we love to get to know the folks that we're talking to. So Gene, you've had sort of an interesting path into what it is that you do. So why don't you give people a sense for, like, where are you from? Where did you catch sort of the bug for history, for preservation? And then we'll talk about what it is you do today. But what's your background?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks not only for having me on the show, which I'm thrilled about. Thank you for doing what you all do. It's important, I believe, I know you all do too, that stories can connect people. And when we have true connection to something, it could be to preservation, or it could be, to a personal relationship or a tradition. The deeper those connections, the deeper value is established. And when we find something that is of value, we're typically motivated. And hopefully, like, that motivation will lead to some form of action that can result in change. And I think what we're both interested in is connecting people more deeply, or providing at least opportunities for folks to get more deeply connected to history and culture, and therefore to be more engaged to take action in preservation. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm from New Orleans, and it's actually fascinating because the way that I got connected to preservation was through an audio form. One, I do believe that who we are as kids is who we are as adults. So I've always been a writer, an entrepreneur, someone who loves adventure. And as it turns out, I've always been a preservationist. And I'm fortunate to be able to apply that passion to pursuits professionally and personally. At 7 years old, on my 7th birthday, my mom took my younger sister and I to a friend's house named Rusty Kershaw. And it was kind of like what you might imagine in the kind of outskirts of the French Quarter of New Orleans. It looked like a house that a musician might live in, a legit musician. His brother, Doug Kershaw, wrote the song Jambalaya as an example. If you don't know it, jump online and hear it. It's a lot of fun. And so my mom took me and my sister over there on my 7th birthday, and he had a recording studio in his home. And so we start playing around. We're reading and reciting poems from Where the Sidewalk Ends. We're like playing with instruments. We're telling jokes. And about 20 minutes into this 40-minute session, Art Neville walks in. The Grammy award-winning Art Neville of the Neville Brothers, which, if you grew up in New Orleans, would be the equivalent of, like, the most mega superstar you can imagine walking into a room. And he sits down and plays with us. And then he gets on the piano and starts playing Sitting Here in Limbo and singing. And Nicholas, I didn't know that what I was feeling, this connection was to a connection of preservation. But I knew that this was an important moment and something that was being captured and recorded, and that was monumental. And the reality of it is that it was an oral history, and today it's a family heirloom. So I got into preservation and catching this, like, enthusiasm and motivation to take action when I was 7.
So I have to ask, what happened on your 8th birthday?
Roller skating. It was also fun.
Yeah, yeah. I was like, how does your mom top that? That's something else. So that's sort of that seminal moment. So when do you jump into a career? Like where do you head from there? So you're in New Orleans, and how do you end up where you are today? What's the path?
It's a great question. The path, to me, as I was inadvertently taking it, was jumping from like one stone to the next. Sometimes it would be an angle, sometimes it'd be forward, sometimes it'd be a little back and another angle. I was meeting with a woman named Dr. Sarah Cook. She's the Associate Dean of the Honors College at Georgia State University, which is a large downtown campus in Atlanta where we're based. We're in Sweet Auburn, so birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement, birthplace of Dr. King. Georgia State University is the largest institution in the state of Georgia. There are 54,000 students. It's the largest majority minority university, I believe, in the country. So they're community and cultural partners with us through work in real estate and also with Constellations, which is a civic socially based shared workspace we might get into later, that I founded with the help from a lot of other people. And I was speaking to Dr. Cook, and she asked me the question that you did. And I was telling her about, well, I started as a writer, and then I went to college and I wrote and published a book because I was in an entrepreneurship program and I wanted to be competitive in a business plan competition. But I really used the book to get a job at Turner Network Television as a content developer. But I had to supplement that income because while it was great, I wasn't making a lot. So I was a freelance writer. And then I started doing press releases and I got into marketing. I started a marketing agency that focused on real estate, but not on like square feet and like the commodity of it, but like where do you get the best cheeseburger close to your house and what's that park over there and things like that. And ultimately like got into preservation, which I know we'll talk more about. And I said, so yeah, I've been jumping around a lot to get here. And she goes, yes. And when you look back, the path's linear, isn't it? And I was like, yeah, it makes perfect sense now. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think one that hopefully helps other people who think that they're kind of just jumping from here to there. It's all going to make sense as long as you follow your passion and purpose.
Yeah, I really like that because there are a lot of people I think listening who are like, well, how do I get into preservation? Or I like this thing, but I'm at this point in my career, or I've had a kid and now I want to jump back in and I don't know how to kind of make my way back in now. And I think it's always so important, like, there's certain threads. I always have this idea that we're going to go back through all these episodes and try and figure out who all, how people got in and what are the common threads between everyone. And I think some of the two common things that I always find is that there's always some spark moment, normally a parent or a loved one or a trusted elder introduces somebody to something and they get excited about it. And then there's sort of the non-direct path. Like it seems like everybody always kind of is this circuitous route. And I think that a lot of times we sit down with somebody like you who's accomplished, who's published books and has the workspace and all these different pieces of success. And we think like, oh, it must have been, they knew exactly what they wanted when they were 7 years old and they've just been working at it the whole time. And I think it's helpful to point out that people take a lot of different paths. And there's a lot of different ways to become a preservationist. There's no one specific term. Before we pressed record, we were talking about, what is this classic preservationist? And I think the good news is that is changing considerably. And there's a lot of different ways to affect preservation and to preserve things that are important to your community. So I guess kind of jumping back up with that thread. So you kind of take this circuitous route into the work that you're doing. Talk to us about the real estate piece, because I want to talk about the shared workspace and that kind of thing. But when you say you worked in real estate and not buy, sell, but where to get the cheeseburger and the park, what does that mean in like a literal sense? How would you describe that kind of work?
Yeah, and we can lead into the actual moment that I got involved in historic preservation as well. Um, with having a marketing firm, I was just frankly bored by the type of real estate marketing that I was seeing. Like I didn't care, what the countertop was made of. I didn't care about the square feet. Growing up in New Orleans, really very fortunate to be exposed to this like rich history and culture, architecture, and like the ramble of the streetcar and Spanish moss. And, it's a city that's got its own, music, it's got its own language, it's got its own food, it's got, these things. And so I came by it honestly. And this is kind of funny. People ask me all the time when they know I'm from New Orleans, oh, have you ever been to Mardi Gras? And I ask them if they've ever been to Monday. Like it's just there.
Right.
And so is history and culture. It's all around us. And so I wanted to really tap into places where we live or work. What is compelling about them outside of like what they're made out of? And that is, it's people that were around. It's a tree canopy. It's a bike path. It's a martini. It's public transportation. And then I started getting more into like, where did those actually come from here in Atlanta? And so I had been interested in and pursuing really just reading and learning and talking to people about history and culture. In 2008, March 14th, 2008, a tornado hit downtown Atlanta. And it carved like a 6-mile path of destruction. And I'll use a landmark that probably a lot of people know, CNN Center and Centennial Olympic Park. And it went down Auburn Avenue. And it hit, among other things, the historic Daily World building. And the Daily World building gets its name from the Atlanta Daily World newspaper, the oldest Black daily newspaper in U.S. history at the time. And it was actually founded in August of 1928, so 96 years ago. And they moved into this building at 145 Auburn in the 30s. And March 14th, 2008 was the last time they were in the building because it had been hit by a tornado and the roof got ripped off and they weren't getting insurance money. So it rained inside there for 4 months. And then for like the next 4 years, it sat there languishing because they didn't have the money to repair it and had to do something. And a developer put it under contract and applied for a demo permit. Well, under the pretense, by the way, and we all hear this in preservation all the time, that it has to be torn down. I come to find out later there wasn't even a structural engineering report. But when I really started paying attention to this is when 1,100 people came together. This is a community will, came together to sign a petition to deny this demo permit. And then the political will of the Atlanta Urban Design Commission, which is an oversight body that regulates historic preservation, also unanimously denied the demolition permit. I was like, this is a really important thing to pay attention to. And at the same time, we do have a brokerage component to our firm. We help people buy, sell, and lease. It's with a cultural focus. And so we had been working on a property in a block away from here. We had helped President Obama help put the campaign re-election headquarters there, followed by Congressman Lewis and his campaign re-election headquarters. We were in a a position of leadership to help establish the John Lewis Hero Mural with the help of the loss prevention, a guy named Mac Wilburn and Central Atlanta Progress and others. So I'd already been like involved in Sweet Auburn in this few block radius. And a woman named Alexa Scott, whose grandfather started the Atlanta Daily World, came to look at bringing the Daily World newspaper back to Auburn. And she was looking at this property on the street, but the only thing I wanted to talk about was her property that was sitting there. And she's like, I'll give you a tour. And we went over there, and she was telling me about personal history and history of the paper and the history of the building. And I was like, can I buy this building and do a historic preservation? She's like, yes, that would be amazing. And I got into preservation at that moment. Interestingly, though, I don't think that I would have been as interested had Hurricane Katrina not occurred in New Orleans, because it takes, we've all heard this, like cliches exist for a reason. Like you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And I can tell you, when you see your home destroyed, in this case, I'm using the word home as a descriptor for an entire city that not only suffered tragic loss of life and the destruction of property, but it also suffered from displacement on par with World War II Europe. And you don't have the people there. And as a result, you don't have the coming together, and you don't have culture, and you don't have like what happens when people get together and do certain things, also known as history. When you don't have that, you know what you've really lost. And I love New Orleans. And I was like, I need to do something in the form of preservation. And then years later, this Daily World moment came to be. That's how I got into preservation. And that's why I think it's vitally important, like, to help preserve place for the purposes of coming together to create new memories and to help impart lessons from the past.
So, for those listening who aren't familiar with Sweet Auburn, or maybe aren't even familiar with it, with sort of just Atlanta beyond the fact that it exists, you've kind of painted the picture of some of the aspects of Sweet Auburn, but obviously it's so important and so evocative and so meaningful that it led you to put this really great book together. And obviously you're located there. Talk to us about Sweet Auburn as a neighborhood, and maybe try and define it for us like you're introducing somebody to the neighborhood for the first time.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the quick overview is that Sweet Auburn is a landmark historic district in Atlanta, Georgia, that was the birthplace of the civil rights movement. Dr. King grew up here. Seeds of a worldview were planted here. It was the absolute mecca of Black wealth, education, community, and progress. But it was only that because it was a constrained environment, sadly, because of discriminatory practices and segregation as law. This amazing, super intelligent, super committed, incredibly industrious, ambitious group of people came together to try to have delivered promises of the Constitution of this country, and to gain true freedom and equality. And by having churches and schools and businesses and advocates and leaders come together, civil rights became a reality in the passing of the Civil Rights Act. This is a story that could fill volume after volume after volume. We don't have enough time on the show. There's not one book that could cover it all. But to say that it is consequential is downplaying it. I would argue that Sweet Auburn is perhaps the most historically significant neighborhood in the world. If you think about right now, forget your political persuasion. You wouldn't see a Black woman as the candidate for a major political party but for what happened in Sweet Auburn and elsewhere in this country. You wouldn't see an all-Black podium in women's gymnastics. You wouldn't have the ascent, long overdue ascent of true positive momentum in women's rights. You wouldn't have this without this kind of nexus. And so it's a really important place, and it's crumbling. So when it was designated a historic landmark district in 1976, since then, 47% of the buildings have been lost. Some of them to tornadoes, some of them to fire, some of them to the wrecking ball, and on and on. We see this in preservation all the time. We need to get our act together, not just like as a neighborhood and as a city and as a state, but as a country to help preserve these buildings, to preserve legacies, to preserve history and culture, and most importantly, to preserve the lessons that were that can be duly imparted from having conversations when you see these buildings that talk about the importance of civil and human rights.
So I want to get into we're going to get into the book. I want to get into the book, but it's hard for me to leave something like that aside. If you were, empowered in a way that you had no limitations on your authority or your the cost or anything like that, what is it that a neighborhood like this really needs? Like what would allow, when you say we need to get our act together, what does that look like if you had no limitations, if you were king for a day, to try and provide the resources that this community needs or that others communities needs? What do you see as perhaps the biggest stumbling block? What would you remove?
Well, it's a great question. I don't know if I would remove anything. What we're trying to do with civil sites as a platform is to provide support to others so that they can get engaged, connected with, through their own personal passion, to have a hand in the preservation. So I'll give you an example. On the Daily World building, there's now a mural called the District 5 Honor Mural. District 5 was Atlanta's first Black Girl Scout troop, and it moved into the Daily World building in 1944. One of the original scouts was a woman named Rosalind Pope. You don't know about her because women were excluded from civil rights history and history, altogether, especially when you compare that to like the inclusion of men or recognition or representation of men. It's important for people to know about Rosalind Pope because she, among other things, was the principal author of an appeal for human rights, which sparked the Atlanta student movement, which sparked the national student movement, which gave credence and power to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which led to success in the civil rights movement, which is why we have the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And no one knows who she is. And it's hard to go and like do the research and have a show like you do, which is, wonderful. It's hard to go write a book. That civil site took me 7 years to write. I mean, it was a lot. But it's not that hard to see a 50 by 30 foot mural and be interested to learn more. I mentioned Georgia State University earlier. 54,000 students, 37,000 of those students are here every week walking around Sweet Auburn. Some of them probably know, but a lot of them probably don't even know the district. And definitely a lot of them didn't know Rosalind Pope. Well, the Girl Scouts of Greater Atlanta wanted to make sure that they could honor District 5. And we ended up connecting really through Atlanta and the city cultural affairs. And we were able to provide a wall on the building where District 5 was. And this is the most fun part. After the building was designed in part by Brian Simons and Loss Prevention, and it was painted by Loss Prevention in collaboration with a woman named Emily Cadena, who happens to be a Girl Scout and a photorealist muralist. The Girl Scouts created a patch. So now if you're a young scout, you can go with your troop or your parents or a friend, and you'll get to go to Sweet Auburn. You think you're going to get a patch, but what they're really seeing on this wall is an image that is conveying the importance of an ideal. It's an artistic and ethereal form of preservation, which is the preservation of women's rights. It's the preservation of Black history. It's the preservation of civil and human rights. And so, yeah, to go back to your question, I just think that we all need to get engaged, and there needs to be a platform of support for that, not just through civil sites, but through all different kinds of folks who want to engage in this effort.
So you boil it down to almost an awareness. If we're not aware of these issues, that's when things really sort of start falling apart, and we allow developers to make this, well, as you said before, it has to come down, right? Like the building has to come down. There's no way we could save this building, that sort of thing. The passion for Sweet Auburn obviously comes through. You're dedicated to it. You make a decision. You mentioned 7+ years ago that you're going to put this thing together. What initially was the concept, and what will people see today when they go and buy a copy of this?
Yes. And thank you for asking these questions, because, PreserveCast is doing the same thing. This is helping to share stories, and not just Atlanta. I mean, all over, all different types of people and different ways of preservation. It's really important. You're doing this, and I did a little bit of my, homework too. You have a degree from a fantastic liberal arts college. You lead a preservation organization in a great state. You choose to help share stories because I would imagine, and tell me if I'm wrong, but this is a personal passion of yours.
Yeah, it's personal, and it's great for us as an organization too. I mean, it's a platform for us to go in depth in a world where we were feeling like everything we were talking about was bite size. It was like, well, if it doesn't fit in an Instagram post, then we can't really share it because it's not going to be read. And this is a different platform to have more in-depth conversations about how and why for preservation, and for people in our state and beyond. Sweet Auburn, is a singular case in that you make that perhaps it's one of the most important neighborhoods, in the world. But the story of what you do here and what somebody does in London or what somebody does in, New Orleans is not just important to those people. It's potentially provides examples for people around the world who are struggling with the same things. Because I think, and we see it in our communities, people think, oh, well, the difference between this one city and this one rural area is so significant. There's nothing, we don't have any commonalities, but the common challenges are very similar. And so I think it's really important for people just to kind of hear about what's going on in other places and take the best of those ideas and try and use it to save history in their community. So that's sort of the idea behind it. Yeah, that's kind of what we're at.
Yeah, and so on the real estate side, and I'll get to the question about civil sites and the writing of it. We have a fundamental principle of our company, which is to demonstrate what's possible. We can just go out there and do our best, and hopefully we're successful. And I mean success in a broad, with a broad definition. Are we enjoying our work? Are we hoping, or, are we making a positive difference in our community, et cetera? What you're doing is a personal passion. What I'm doing is a personal passion. Whatever anyone's personal passion is, you can apply that to something that you care about. If you get connected to preservation through the stories that you're hearing on PreserveCast, or that you may read in civil sites, or that you come about elsewhere, you don't have to go start your own radio show or write a book. If you're someone who paints, you can paint a mural. If you're someone who's into theater, write a play, dance a dance, sing a song, write a poem, take a walk with a friend. Like, all of those matter. So just wanted to make sure to share that. With civil sites, I wanted to start writing about this history, which I was finding difficult to access. And there are reasons for that. One, civil rights history, and in particular, like, all of the different people that came together to make success in that movement possible, not everyone was included. Women were really not included in that history. I mean, I read 12,000 pages to write 230, and it's abundantly clear that women are not included in civil rights history, and not included, again, at the same level as men in history altogether. And so I really decided to take this approach of helping to share stories of the unknown, the unsung, and the underrepresented heroes and heroines of this movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was someone who changed the world. And there's not a whole lot more that I can write about Dr. King that hasn't been written. I can help supplement his story and help illuminate the stories of others by focusing on people that we don't know that much about. And so that's what I started to do, but it became really difficult to find this in one place. So Civil Sites, in addition to being this history book and guidebook, is also now a definitive resource for the people and places in Sweet Auburn. But the real reason why it took me 7 years is not all that. It's that, Nicholas, I got to 100 pages, and then I had to put it down, and I couldn't write page 101. And I put it down for 2 or 3 months, and I pick it back up, but to figure out where I was, I had to read the 100 pages again. And then I was kind of deflated, and I put it down. This happened for years. And finally, I was just honest with myself, and I'm like, the reason you can't go to page 101 is because the rest of this thing is crap. You need to start over. It just wasn't good enough. And what changed was getting the chance to work with 2 different people. One, his name is Trevor Williams. He leads a company called Global Atlanta. It's journalism. He became my editor. The other is I got the chance to work with a cultural editor named Jacqueline Jones Royster. She was the dean of the Ivan Allen College when I was at Georgia Tech. Jackie brought perspectives that I don't have and that I never will have. For one, I'm not a woman. I'm not Black. I wasn't born in a segregated South. I've never been the dean of a college. I'm not a linguist. But these are really important perspectives if you're going to be writing about this important history. And so I had this accountability, and I also had homework. So I met every Friday with Trevor for a year, and I would bring in that week's work, and he would turn the entire page red, and I have to go back and work on that while providing new work. And he would leave me with this at the end of each session: don't be a lazy writer. And I took that to heart. The other thing, sites is pretty comprehensive, but one day I was having a rough day and I was speaking to Jackie and I was like, I'm just overwhelmed. Like this history is so important and these people are so incredible and it's just so much. And she goes, Gene, it's just one little book. And that was liberating. There's too much history out there. So, finally I had like accountability, I had deadlines, I had focus, and I was able to get this done.
So the other thing about the book that I really enjoyed, and I look at a lot of these, and is, and I was telling you before we hit record, I was like, I think if you had just had a bunch of really pretty pictures of the different buildings, it would have been fine. But the sketches kind of bring it to life and add, it's interesting. I don't know why, but the sketch adds like a human sort of approach or feeling to it. It's approachable, and it kind of draws you in, and you're kind of studying these lines that put these buildings together. What was the thought process on that? Because that is unique, for sort of this architectural preservation approach to history. Normally, we sort of think in the lens of like Habs level documentation. We want black and white, large format photography. And you went in a different direction, and I think it really worked.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you like it. I mean, I have to give 1,000,000% of the credit of that to Clay Kenningham, who's been an amazing collaborator and contributor and is the illustrator of Civil Sites. His work is astounding. He just happens to be super talented. Um, Meeting Clay helped change the course of history for civil sites, at least, in my personal history. And it's funny because I was like bored one day, scrolling around Instagram, and this like illustration popped up. I'm like, my goodness, this is good. And it was and illustrations about things that I'm interested in, old buildings and streetscapes. And it has like kind of a crumb type of feel. So where it's like, it's not trying to be pristine. It includes like power lines and flaws and like weeds growing out of the sidewalk and these types of things. And then I went to like Clay's bio, and I'm like, this is a kid at Georgia Tech. I'm at Georgia Tech in grad school. I'm going to send him a note. And the next day we met for coffee. We were like a block from each other. And we hit it off. And I told him about like civil sites, and he told me about his work. And I was like, let's do this. It ended up being such a great decision because not only is like the work beautiful, it chronicles a moment in time. It is a snapshot. And this is important because the next second, everything changes. That's what happens in the world. Like, evolution, adaptation, just things that occur. And we wanted something that people can look back at in like, the years and decades to follow and say, this is what Sweet Auburn was. Hopefully we see continued preservation. Hopefully we see programmatic, growth. Hopefully we look at these buildings and like, yep, same building. Now it's a theater company. Now it's an art center. Now it's a whatever. But the fact of the matter is that we're also going to look back and read and see Clay's sketches and realize that that building's not there, which is precisely why it's important to have this artwork and the narrative, because we're not going to have a lot of these buildings around to have the conversations to connect us. It's also why the oral history is important. I mean, your shows are really wonderful. On a personal level, though, I find the greatest value of them to be these oral histories that you're capturing. Because just like buildings, once a voice is gone, it's gone.
Yeah,
unless you have it.
we've sort of joked, and I guess it's not even really a joke, but we've sort of said that this is sort of like an oral history of preservation in the 20 teens, 2020s. That would be nice to have from like the 1960s. Like it'd be great to be able to sit down and listen to the people who sat around and and some of them wrote things, but we don't have a lot of interviews with those people who wrote the National Historic Preservation Act or, those sorts of things. I mean, there's been research that's been done and there's been things that have been published, and we've had some of those folks on, like John Sprinkle, who's a historian of preservation, essentially. But yeah, I mean, I think hopefully at some point in the future, some of these will be valuable that way. And I know a couple institutions have archived some of them in their digital archives because they speak to a certain moment in time about what was happening in a certain place. And I think that our understanding of preservation and what matters to us now is interesting because we are at sort of an inflection moment. And as you say, things are always sort of changing.
Yeah, and just if
First,
I may add,
yeah.
that you do it professionally and you all do it so well. I had I had understood this as that 7-year-old kid on his birthday, though. Like, I couldn't have defined it the way that you just did, but I knew, and we all kind of know what is important to us and what's meaningful. It really doesn't matter necessarily what that is as long as you go do it. And it doesn't even have to do with preservation. We're talking about that. Although I think preservation is fully pervasive, environmental preservation, preservation of like Native American language, preservation of rights, preservation of buildings, but whatever you're into, go do.
Yeah, and I liked your point too. I think it's another important one to kind of tease out of here is that you don't have to be a professional in this. You don't have to write a book. You don't have to do a podcast. I mean, you can do those things, but you can also, one of the other things is you can introduce a kid to history or preservation because who knows where that will go, what kind of seed you plant there. Or you can sketch. And then I think that kind of comes back full circle to the book is that sitting down in the act of looking at something, even if you don't feel like you're particularly good at it, you don't have to publish it or sell it. But the act of sitting down and looking at something and drawing it makes you notice things that you don't otherwise. And I think that's also the value of those sketches in the book is that they make you notice things that perhaps you wouldn't otherwise. So where do you go from here? Where does the story continue? What do you hope Civil Sites does, and what are you going to do next?
Yeah, I mean, Civil Sites is ideally this resource to hopefully connect people to this history, inspire them to go out and make it their own by engaging in projects and that are appealing to them. Like I said, I mean, if someone ends up reading something that inspires them in whatever form, that would be great. As you know, and a lot of your listeners know, historic preservation is hard. I mean, I've led, I think, 7 historic preservation projects. You 5 of them utilizing the historic tax credit, which is a great tool. I've been to Washington, lobbied on behalf of the tax credit. It was a lot of fun. I got to learn how Washington works. By the way, we're not always arguing. Like there are people meeting in rooms that want to work together, which is fun to see. When I went there, on lobby day, it was when Congressman Lewis was still in DC. And I was like, why are we even going to Congressman Lewis's office? I mean, of course he's going to support preservation of Sweet Auburn Historic District. And the answer was leaders need to hear from constituents. That's why. So in any event, all that to say, where does it go from here? I don't know. I like on a personal level that it's helping to have more of these conversations. If it's okay with you, I would like to read like one small paragraph from the book, which talks about, or I think like helps punctuate the real purpose of the book, which is, of course, preservation. So is it okay if I read?
Absolutely. I think that'd be fantastic.
Okay, so this is from the introduction. of civil sites. In 1854, less than a decade before the onset of the American Civil War, a free Black woman named Laura Lavinia Kelly Combs purchased a small lot at the intersection of Whitehall Street and Wheat Street, now Auburn Avenue. This visionary acquisition, Combs became the first Black person to own property in Sweet Auburn, a district later recognized as the primary nexus of Black culture and commerce in the United States, despite extreme challenges in the face of institutionalized segregation. In a move foreshadowing the neighborhood's ethos of empowerment, Combs soon directed her investment toward a profound and deeply personal mission, exchanging that land for something of far greater value, her husband's freedom from slavery. The people who came together here made a lasting, positive impact on society and on the world. And that history is crumbling around us. If you're interested in learning more about these incredible people and their stories, I hope that you'll pick up Civil Sites. If you just love history, I hope you'll pick up Civil Sites. If you love illustration and architecture and art, I hope you'll pick up Civil Sites. And then I hope you'll take it and be inspired and do your own thing with it.
Well, and the highest praise I can give it, and that was a fantastic intro. I remember reading that, so I'm glad that was the piece you selected. But I got the advanced electronic copy, so I could do a little bit of reviewing, and I am absolutely going to buy a copy of it. I want a physical copy of my own. It's a fantastic piece of work. And I'm so glad we've had the chance to sit down with you. In terms of buying it, we'll put a link in the show notes, but where would you direct people to? Where's the best place to get it? When can they get it? Tell us the details on actually acquiring a physical copy.
Sure. So this is forthcoming from the University of Georgia Press. It's a co-publication with Georgia Humanities. It will be publication dates February 2025. You can pre-order online. Although I would encourage everyone to go to your favorite independent bookstore and just ask them to order it. It's fun. You get to support local. If you want to learn more, you can also go to civilsites.com. And that is sites, SIGHTS. So civilsites.com. It's a good place to go and visit.
Fantastic. Well, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. So much fun to dig into this. I want to have you back again sometime just to talk about other things that you're working on. We didn't really get a chance to get into the co-working site, but we'll do that. We'll just have to have you back and dig into all of that. And we'll make sure to encourage people, not only when they listen to this episode, to pick up the book, but we'll do a re-release in February as well, so that people are reminded when it's officially out that now's the time to get it if they haven't pre-ordered. But Gene, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks for joining us today.
I have loved being here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for all that you all do.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.